Architect Tom Vonier supports public and private clients with global industrial and business operations, focusing on design and security planning. The National Academy of Sciences appointed him as an independent expert to lead groundbreaking research on security for U.S. foreign mission buildings. Mr. Vonier is a member of the board of directors for the American Institute of Architects and a regional vice president in Europe for ASIS International, the global security organization. Tom will discuss some basic design principles for security and how we could begin to define the success of security elements.
Thank you. This is a challenging audience, I think. You know, these are people here, I know some of you, who are quite accomplished and knowledgeable in the field of security in buildings. This is a city that has grappled with these things for a long time. What I bring, I think, is a long time in the game, as Brian said. I've been around this kind of work for something going on 30 years. And I've worked on and studied places all over the world. And so I hope that I can add something to the discussion based on those qualifications. Brian has talked about the nature of threats. I don't want to go through that. I think the point for me, though, is that police and intelligence methods are not really very effective at thwarting a determined attacker. And so the implication is that the targets of attackers, which tend to be buildings, become the first line of defense against attackers. And so, as Brian has said, and as I think you'll hear from Alan, there are precedents in history for places that have been designed to meet the challenges of physical security, carried to a high level by Vauban in France and in parts of Germany, defeated, of course, by the advent of ballistic theory and aviation and gunpowder and all the things it sort of overcame. And I think it has to be said that certain kinds of cities, this is the Nolly plan of Vienna, Austria, are more easily defended from that point of view than certain other kinds of cities. This is a portion of the plan for downtown Oklahoma City, because those cities really grew out of the need for defense. So the starting point, as far as I'm concerned, this is from a study by Deloitte Touche in the Netherlands of the targets of attack in Europe over this period of time. And I think it underscores the idea that buildings, physical places where people congregate, where institutions are lodged, are the targets of terrorism. And it also must be said that terrorism is not the only dimension of security with which we have to be concerned. Does anybody here know what an apéro géant is? A giant cocktail? This is a new phenomenon in France where I live. This is a group of young people who gathered on a Friday night in the center of Nantes on the strength of so-called social media, texting, for a giant cocktail, a giant bottle party in the middle of town. This group materialized at the snap of a finger. So in this civil unrest that we've seen in London, 5 years ago in Paris, very severe civil unrest, huge property destruction, there are new forces and mechanisms at work. That's a dimension of security. There is also criminal conduct and methods used by criminals which are on the scale and have the same effect as weapons and tactics used by terrorists. This is the aftermath of a Brinks robbery in Paris 2 months ago, where the Serbian perpetrators had access to automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, all sorts of techniques and tactics that are highly destructive. The point is that industrial accidents, civil unrest, natural catastrophe, all of these other elements of modern society are as much a factor in security as, I would say, the threat of terrorism. I want to do three things in my, 12 remaining minutes. I'd like to talk a little bit about principles of security planning. I'd like to talk about, as Marcel said, what I think of as success, what characterizes success, what are successful tactics and strategies. And then finally, I want to touch on technology a little bit, because I think Brian closed by talking about domain awareness, and I want to talk about some of the technologies of domain awareness, to use your term. All of this has a history. Anyone as old as I am will remember Oscar Newman, the idea of defensible space, this architect who did a series of publications and diagrams and drawings about how design could be used to make public housing safer for the people who live in the public housing. And he coined this term defensible space. This antecedent has its modern equivalents. Here's the Royal Institute of British Architects talking about how to design against terrorism and how to promote safer cities and urban places through the intervention of design. These are classic ideas. There's no particular mystery or secret to it. The basic premise is that some sense of ownership of space promotes vigilance, which in turn yields security. And much of what the RIBA has talked about for commercial and residential properties in London has to do with these sort of classic notions. Let me take one example that's very close to my heart, the Parisian Cafe. Many of you have been to the Parisian Cafe, and believe me, if the owner has tables on the sidewalk, and if he is serving customers or she is serving customers on the sidewalk, that cafe owns the sidewalk to the street, and they even own a part of the street. They are constantly looking at who is parking there, what they're doing, what the demeanor is, what the comportment is. This is an illustration of this sense of creating ownership of public space. And it's not just French cafe society. This is New York City. The same principle is at work. The owner owns the sidewalk to the street and probably takes an interest in who parks there and what they're doing. And this is just a sort of simple-minded illustration, I think, of the idea that a sense of ownership promotes vigilance, which in turn gives us security. I've translated from the French the ideas that they are now promoting for crime prevention in public space, in parks, public squares, things of that nature. For any of you who are architects, designers, I think these ideas are familiar to you, but they sum up, I'd say, the collective judgment of the design industry about what can be done in a sort of principle level to promote this sense of ownership and this sense that there's vigilance, and not just for counterterrorism, but for all sorts of things. The question is, how do you do that? And the challenge is, how do you accomplish that? And I wanted to make 2 points about that. One is that I think visible clues in the environment do actually help. Again, an example from Paris, when their so-called vigipirate renforcé, that's their level of alert in the environment when there's a terrorist threat or some other security threat. When that was announced, all of a sudden all of the public waste baskets in the cities were removed, and these transparent trash containers were placed everywhere in the city. If you've been there, you've seen it. You also have started to see commandos patrolling with ordinary municipal police all over the city, especially at the landmarks and in the public transit stations. We have that in New York City. We have it in some other places in the United States. I contend that these visible clues in the environment, the presence of another one is in front of school buildings and religious institutions, all parking is banned. And they have a new barrier that's being put in front of all these institutions that prevent vehicles from stopping and staying in place in front of them. Another visible clue in the environment. Great Britain is, of course, long experienced at this, partly through the IRA campaign in the 60s and 70s, but there are lots of clues in the visible environment in London that tell you to be vigilant and to pay attention and to watch. The second point I want to make is that obvious protective infrastructure, that is, things that are obviously designed to deter, have some value. That's the whole principle behind the idea of a safe in a bank. It is protective, it's a deterrent, it actually has some value if somebody tries to breach it. So I think we should not shy away from the idea that obvious protective infrastructure is something we want to avoid. What we need to shy away from is this sort of heavy-handed idea that because it's big and thick and has flowers in it, it's okay. And I think we've seen, partly from our friends in the precast concrete industry and partly from entrepreneurs and other disciplines, this proliferation of objects that we can place in the landscape that will stop a truck moving at a certain speed, weighing a certain amount. And I think that's what we have to be careful of. This is a security fence around a monastery in central Barcelona that is designed to arrest vehicles and deter climbing. And I think with a level of design attention and some sense of what we have to accomplish, we can really do so much better. I want to sum up principles. We won't have time to go into all of them tonight, but to me, a successful strategy for intervening in the physical environment on behalf of security involves trying to make sure that the strategies we use serve more than one purpose. A simple-minded example is the plinth at the base of a building that extends out, keeps vehicles away, and is also a place for plantings, landscape features, other elements in the environment. There are dozens of them if you take the time to look. This multifunctionality, I think, is a very important property and part of successful practice. The same with keeping things simple and light, the same with flexibility, and also the idea that some are intentionally visible elements in the landscape, but some are not. And all are legitimate strategies and principles, I think, that we should employ when we sort of examine successful strategies. I want to close now. I've got, what, 7 or 8 minutes, something like that, just talking about the intervention at the urban scale and the notion of defining precincts, areas, zones, areas of control. I've coined this distinction between secure enclaves, which I would say, let's say the Commerce Department is one. You're challenged at the door as to the nature of your business. You're required to present an identification. You submit to physical search. And once you're in the building, there's some reasonable assurance that you've entered an enclave that is secure. And this sort of approach is typical of these kinds of facilities. More interesting to me, and I think more promising in terms of being able to address the issues we've heard raised tonight, is this idea of urban control zones. Here are the characteristics I think they have. I'm going to close sort of on this part of the talk with 2 examples. One in France, the Rue Montorgueil, which is in the center of the city, a very congested, busy, dense part of Paris, has now for 12 years been closed to all vehicular traffic except for vehicles that have a permit to enter. This is the first generation of these bollards, very familiar to most of you, which you can raise and lower by use of a card at a control point. You see the arm coming out of the vehicle to get in and out of this area of the city. Here is the more recent version. They're upgrading the nature of some of the hardware being used for this system. But the result is an area of the city where one has reasonable assurance that any vehicle that is present there somehow has a legitimate purpose. Furthermore, this was not done for security, it was done for amenity. It was done to reduce congestion, improve conditions for pedestrians, and in a sense, elevate the quality of life for that part of the city. It's an example, though, of an urban control zone, of a strategy extended to multiple blocks and parts of a city. I want to spend a little bit of time on Lafayette Square because I've been looking at that over the years. I've I've been in and out of Washington since 1969. That's a long time, and always lived in the city and know Lafayette Square pretty well. It's the area above. For those of you who don't know it, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is the portion of the White House that faces Lafayette Square. And for the longest time, up until, you could help me, Bill, when Pennsylvania Avenue was closed, perhaps in '95, anybody could drive past the White House. Today, it's gone through an evolution that I think is quite successful. And these dots that I've placed these dots here, the red ones are observation posts and control points that are already in place. And these are Secret Service, uniformed Secret Service. Some are in plain clothes, and they have, of course, mounted Secret Service all through the area on bicycles, in automobiles, sometimes on horseback. The point is, though, that for this urban control zone, anyone who enters this zone around the Treasury building, the old Executive Office building, the White House, Lafayette Square, Jackson Place, all the government buildings there, is subject to the scrutiny of someone, a human being, who is looking at that person, evaluating his or her comportment, what they're wearing, what they're carrying, their demeanor. And they have, as a consequence, been very successful in keeping to a bare minimum the kinds of attacks that anyone on foot or on a bicycle could carry out against the White House. Yes, there are jumpers and scalers routinely, but they're almost always caught before they get very far. There was one incident not too long ago where someone did manage to get in with a long gun and next to the White House. That was thwarted too. But in general, the idea of identifying choke points, places where people must pass in order to get into an area, and then deploying people to look at those people as they enter and evaluate them as they enter, is quite a successful strategy, I think. And what I mean by the blue dots is a question mark. I don't know what is in store for the ellipse or the other areas, but I think if it mirrors in some sense what has been done on the north, it's quite successful. And I think once you're in this area, you certainly don't have, I think, a sense of entering an armed camp or somehow being subjected to unpleasant scrutiny as you enter this area. And once you're in it, it's quite an agreeable place to be. Certainly better than it was when when the street was open to automobile traffic. From any point of view you'd care to mention. This is my opinion. My point in bringing all this up as I close is to say that these are methods and approaches that can be applied systematically to areas of cities. And we can look for natural portals, natural places where people have to go to be able to come through. And I think in looking at that scale, it's important to identify guidelines and approaches that are suitable for typical situations. The last point is important to me because I think we give short shrift to the surveillance professionals who are out there. I think these are people who actually are pretty skilled in evaluating public behavior, and we ought to elevate their stature. I'm going to close on technology. Here's the evolution of the cell phone. Same kind of things are happening in the security apparatus. Some of it is cosmetic, some of it is real technology. Too few of the tools and technologies that are coming out are designed for the purposes of analysis and sort of evaluation. This is some work by a man named Torrance in Arizona about crowd behavior. He has very interesting models of how crowds behave. He can tell you, for example, this is the exodus pattern from a building with a corner entrance when somebody pulls a fire alarm. It's a different pattern when somebody says there's a bomb in the building. If suddenly the alert is the bomb is in a car parked on the street, he can show the patterns of movement and running. And there's been a lot of work, partly from soccer stadium tragedies, about crowd behavior, which I think is a very important dimension of what we're about, especially if we start defining zones where there are large numbers of people. Similarly, some of you are aware, I'm sure, of research that's being done about dispersion of material in the atmosphere in an urban landscape and what effects wind patterns and building forms have on material moving through the environment, toxic material moving through the environment, either deliberately released or as a result of an industrial accident. There aren't many other design tools. Brian mentioned this domain awareness. Britain, partly from, sort of the legacy of the military hardware, has made a huge investment in this drone technology for municipal police purposes. Just a case where they were able to use this drone controlled with a handset by a guy wearing these glasses that gives him the visibility of the drone in apprehending a ring of car thieves. It's kind of odd and silly in a way, but it is a technology that has some very interesting applications. Some of them are the product of the visibility we have in the environment now. There's a group working in the Air Force now to develop a tool that recognizes aberrant patterns in the urban environment based on learning video imagery, sound imagery, and other data gathered over time, so that when there's something anomalous that's happened, a sound, like ShotSpotter. Do you know what ShotSpotter is? Are people familiar with that? Anyone? Most police departments now have something called ShotSpotter, which is an acoustic device that allows them to pinpoint within 300 meters where a shot has been fired, where was the weapon when the shot was fired. This is just a listening device that's out on top of buildings. They have a console, and it tells them where it was. Some of them, though, are not technological, they're social. This is something called Internet Eyes, also in Britain, where people watch environments for aberrant behavior or something alerting on their computers at home, sometimes their televisions at home, and there's a whole system that these entrepreneurs have developed that allows them to alert a store owner or somebody if they see something that they think warrants it. It's got cash incentives. The basic principle is you're sitting at home, you watch, and you're looking at an image of a store and somebody's shoplifting. The merchant doesn't have time to do that, but there are lots of people with time on their hands. And it's actually going pretty well for this company. So I think there are a range of technologies and social innovations that do portend something for domain awareness that has design implications that can be applied at the urban scale in this sense of zones. Every city I know of that is a seat of government has done something to implement this urban control zone theory. Now in Paris, where the Élysée Palace is, when the president is coming or going, or when a foreign dignitary is visiting or leaving, it becomes an urban control zone because they have the human resources to do that instantly. They can stop traffic for blocks around. They can prevent pedestrians from moving in that area for blocks around. And at any time, whether or not there's a dignitary present or the president is there, they have eyes on the street watching vehicles, people, behavior. And I think that's such an important part of the formula in any design intervention. This is the Arsenal football stadium. I show it because these letters were designed to be resistant to a vehicle attack, a very substantial vehicle attack. And the idea of multifunctionality, of being able to do more than one thing with an object in the environment, to me is illustrated in part by this. It's interesting when you look at the Home Office guidance in Great Britain. This is the project that was done at Whitehall to introduce this plinth and balustrade out away from the building toward the street to prevent vehicle barriers. What they're really looking at are classical, integrated, multifunctioning elements that can be introduced into the landscape to accomplish the security purpose. On the top, Vienna, Paris, London, Brussels, cities I know very well. These are cities that evolved over time, generated in some measure by security, the need for a security intervention. They are already naturally zoned, you might say. They are already divided somewhat naturally into zones, at least political subdivisions, but many times those have physical reasons. And you will see that many of the security interventions are based on these zones. I think we have a methodology, I think we have an intellectual framework and a discipline that would allow us to apply that same kind of thinking, if it hasn't been already, to the Federal Triangle, to look at where the natural portals are, where we can enhance and elevate the status of the watchers, where we can introduce elements in the landscape that will thwart certain kinds of attack, but also add amenity. And it seems to me that's where the challenge lies. Thank you. Alan, it's over to you.